First he spoke freely of his intention to start shortly for Liverpool and take ship for America, a resolution which cost his good mother some pain, for after Jacob the idiot, there was not one of her sons to whom her heart clung more than to her youngest born, David. Next, it appeared to him that Sunday afternoon, when everybody was gone to church except Jacob and the cowboy, was so singularly favourable an opportunity for sons who wanted to appropriate their mother's guineas, that he half thought it must have been kindly intended by Providence for such purposes. Especially the third Sunday in Lent, because Jacob had been out on one of his occasional wanderings for the last 2 days, and David, being a timid young man, had a considerable dread and hatred of Jacob, as of a large personage who went about habitually with a pitchfork in his hand. Nothing could be easier, then, than for David on this Sunday afternoon to decline going to church, on the ground that he was going to tea at Mr. Lunn's, whose pretty daughter Sally had been an early flame of his, and when the church-goers were at a safe distance, to abstract the guineas from their wooden box and slip them into a small canvas bag. Nothing easier than to call to the cowboy that he was going, and tell him to keep an eye on the house for fear of Sunday tramps. David thought it would be easy, too, to get to a small thicket and bury his bag in a hole he had already made and covered up under the roots of an old hollow ash; and he had, in fact, found the hole without a moment's difficulty, had uncovered it, and was about gently to drop the bag into it, when the sound of a large body rustling towards him with something like a bellow was such a surprise to David, who, as a gentleman gifted with much contrivance, was naturally only prepared for what he expected, that instead of dropping the bag gently, he let it fall so as to make it untwist and vomit forth the shining guineas. At the same moment he looked up and saw his dear brother Jacob close upon him, holding his pitchfork, so that the bright smooth prongs were a yard in advance of his own body, and about a foot off David's. A learned friend, to whom I once narrated this history, observed that it was David's guilt which made these prongs formidable, and that the mens nil conscia sibi strips a pitchfork of all terrors. I thought this idea so valuable that I obtained his leave to use it on condition of suppressing his name. Nevertheless, David did not entirely lose his presence of mind, for in that case he would have sunk on the earth or started backward, whereas he kept his ground and smiled at Jacob, who nodded his head up and down and said, "Hoiks, Davy," in a painfully equivocal manner. David's heart was beating audibly, and if he had had any lips they would have been pale, but his mental activity, instead of being paralyzed, was stimulated. While he was inwardly praying, he always prayed when he was much frightened, "Oh, save me this once, and I'll never get into danger again," he was thrusting his hand into his pocket in search of a box of yellow lozenges, which he had brought with him from Brigford, among other delicacies of the same portable kind, as a means of conciliating proud beauty, and more particularly the beauty of Miss Sarah Lunn. Not one of these delicacies had he ever offered to poor Jacob, for David was not a young man to waste his jujubes and barley sugar in giving pleasure to people from whom he expected nothing. But an idiot with equivocal intentions and a pitchfork is as well worth flattering and cajoling as if he were Louis Napoleon. So David, with a promptitude equal to the occasion, threw down his box of yellow lozenges, lifted the lid, and performed a pantomime with his mouth and fingers, which was meant to imply that he was delighted to see his dear brother Jacob, and seized the opportunity of making him a small present, which he would find particularly agreeable to the taste. Jacob, you understand, was not an intense idiot, but within a certain limited range knew how to choose the good and reject the evil. He took one lozenge, by way of test, and sucked it as if he had been a philosopher. Then, in as great an ecstasy at its new and complex savour as Caliban at the taste of Trinculo's wine, chuckled and stroked his suddenly beneficent brother, and held out his hand for more. For, except in fits of anger, Jacob was not ferocious or needlessly predatory.